You are good to go.
Thank you, Deputy Clerk. I'd like to call the meeting, I thought I was ready. I'll start over. I'd like to call the Committee of the Whole meeting of January 25th, 2023 to order. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lynn Timmers, Councillor and Chair of General Business and Finance Committee. Due to inclement weather, we are meeting electronically this evening through Zoom. As a reminder to members of Council, we will be voting by a show of hands tonight. Please remember to keep your hands lifted until the clerk has declared the vote or advises otherwise. Members of the public may observe the proceedings by accessing the live webcast on our YouTube channel. I will ask our Deputy Clerk to complete the roll call of committee so that we can confirm everyone's attendance and confirm quorum.
Thank you, Chair Timmers. All members are in attendance tonight with the exception of Mayor Easton, who does send her regrets, and Councillor Pachiripa will be joining us momentarily. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In addition, I want to take a moment to welcome the staff we have joining us today electronically. Chief Administrative Officer Mike Rukopoulos, Director of Legislative Services, Town Clerk Julie Kirkolos, Director of Finance, Administration and Innovation Lawrence Wagner, Director of Economic Development and Communications Paul Deaney, Director of Community Services Shannon McKay, Director of Planning and Development Matt Bruder, Director of Public Works Dave Graham, Associate Director of Public Works Jillian Harris, Legislative and Committee Coordinator Deanna Phillips. And moderating and clerking the meeting today, we have our Manager of Legislative Services, Deputy Clerk Devan Cripps. IT staff are also in attendance. Also, we have Gary Scanlon, Byron Tan, and Sean Michael Stephen from Watson and Associates Economists. As this is a virtual meeting, I will ask that we follow some procedures during this electronic meeting. Members of council and staff, please be reminded that when speaking, please ensure your camera is on. Should there be a connection of service disruption for the chair or quorum is lost, the chair and or clerk will call a 10-minute recess to reconnect and to regain quorum. If quorum is lost, the meeting will be adjourned. If connection is lost from the chair, the vice chair will resume the meeting. Once reconnection is achieved, the chair will assume their role. Each member of committee who wishes to speak, please use the raise hand feature on your video call, and the clerk will track our speakers list today and then invite you to speak when I open it up for comments or questions. Also, when I finish reading a motion, the clerk will then call out the vote by show of hands and ask those in favor and those opposed. Please remember to keep your hands lifted until the clerk has declared the vote or advises otherwise. Also, if you're able, please keep your video on at all times. And when not speaking, please remember to put yourself on mute. And if you could silence your cell phones or turn them off. Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest? I am seeing none. Do members have any amendments to the order of the agenda? No, I see none. Statutory public meetings, we have none this evening. Under consent agenda, we have no consent items. Under General Business and Finance Committee agenda delegations, we have no delegations. We will now consider item 7.2.1, report AD 0123, Beamsville Downtown Business Improvement Area, BIA, 2023 budget. The Director of Economic Development and Communications will provide opening remarks. And Paul, could you please go ahead?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening, members of council. So before you tonight is a report for the Downtown Business Improvement Area, the Downtown Bench, or BIA. This is a little bit of a housekeeping rule, as members of council do know that every year, as a local board of council, we do need to approve the levy amount. And so back in November, the BIA met as a board of directors and their membership and have approved a levy amount of $95,000. So in front of you this evening is that budget, that operating expense. In addition, there's the slate of directors for the upcoming year. And as you can see, those members are listed on the attached appendix. Happy to answer any questions if there are any. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Paul. Do members of council have any questions? And I'm not seeing any hands.
Me either, Chair.
There being no further discussion, I have a motion. Oh, Councillor Russell, you just snuck in there.
Thank you, Chair Timmers. Again, just as part of the BIA being newly appointed to it, I just wanted to say again, thanks for having this brought forward. Again, there's a lot of plans and they're very exciting. Again, I've kind of gone through my first meeting with our director Steph to see all the exciting things that are being planned for this year, which are outlined. And again, I couldn't be more impressed, and I know how much the businesses downtown are appreciative of some of the activities that are going to be planned are. And again, I look forward to a great year. I think there's a lot of great things planned.
And with that, I have a motion moved by Councillor Russell. The council endorsed the 2023 operating budget for the Beamsville Downtown Business Improvement Area, attached as Appendix A to report AD 0123 in the amount of $115,000, and that the levy portion of the operating budget for the Beamsville Downtown Business Improvement Area in the amount of $95,000 be approved, and that the treasurer be hereby authorized and directed to make arrangements to levy an amount of $95,000 against rateable properties in the Beamsville Downtown Business Improvement Area pursuant to Section 208 of the Municipal Act 2001 and the Town of Lincoln Bylaw number 2019-16 to levy the 2023 budget as referenced above, and that the schedule of payments for 2023 be in accordance with the Town of Lincoln tax payment schedule, and that council endorse the Beamsville Downtown Business Improvement Area's 2023 slate of officers of the board. I will now ask our deputy clerk to call out the vote.
Thank you, Chair. And all those members in favor, please raise your hand. Thank you. And all those opposed? Thank you. That motion carries.
Thank you very much, Deputy Clerk. Tonight, we will review the proposed 2023 rates and fees. This is an essential funding source generating revenue and cost recovery for the fee for services we provide to the community and business sectors. Infrastructure investment in our community helps drive economic growth and enhances our community. We look forward to the spirited and good-mannered conversation ahead. Prior to proceeding with the presentations, I will ask our Chief Administrative Officer and Director of Finance, Administration and Innovation to provide introductory comments to report FN 0123. Mike, our CIO, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening to you and all of council this evening. As you know, tonight we enter into another phase of the budget process, the rates and fees. And so just to give you a little bit of background, and as you highlighted, Chair, our Director of Finance is going to make some comments, as well as our Director of Planning, and as well our Director of Public Works as we kick this off. We will keep our comments brief, but I think it's important to lay a little bit of that foundation, both for members of council, but also for the community and anybody watching or any of the media that are going to report on this. So a little bit of that background when we're talking about two things, rates and fees, and I'll get into those briefly. But when we looked at fees, I think like we've said to you, when we put together capital budgets, when we put together costing, we always consider what's happening around us. So we've considered the economy and inflation, the cost to provide services, the levy impact is always top of mind, and how this integrates, and these dollars and cents that we're going to end up collecting, how they integrate with our long-term plans and projects. The fees is a key part of our budget, and as I said, is integrated with the budget process. And like any input or revenue, we need to ensure that the costs we charge are reflective of the work, and at the same time balancing the impact to stakeholders. Chair, I want to highlight the time and effort and how long it's taken us to get here. With water, it's been a 2-year exercise. And with planning, And we've heard a lot of comments on the planning for members of council over the last few days. That's taken us 6 months to get to where we are today. So like I said, with all elements of our budget, you've heard me say this before, a ton of analysis goes into it, and a level of rigor and detail happens before we even come to you, before we engage with our consultants, and then all the time and energy put into engaging with those consultants. As you all know, and I think as we all know, we have a responsibility to manage costs to taxpayers and ratepayers. So what you have before you this evening reflects that. In other words, we want to ensure that those services that residents receive and the charges that we put on those services are appropriate and are appropriately paid for by the correct groups of people and stakeholders, so that it's not a burden to local residents where it's not appropriate. Lastly, I think it's important to highlight that the rates in some cases haven't been adjusted for an extended period of time, and many members of council will recall that and remember previous conversations on those particular items. And the monies are used to pay for things we have seen costs rise for on a very regular basis. So while we have kept things for an extended period of time at the same level, we've seen costs increase, and some of those costs increase daily as we see. So we are playing catch up. And again, this is reflected in those new fees and rates that you're going to talk to and hear about this evening. To end my comments, I know I've had a few questions about fees, especially planning fees over the last few days, as I just said. And will this scare off development potentially? I'd suggest that the impacts on the various groups isn't much. And that isn't to suggest we shouldn't be cognizant of it, but the right stakeholders need to be paying the right fees at the appropriate time. And I can share with members of council the conversations I have with our building and development community and where the costs that they face and the costs that they bear are coming from. And I would suggest they fit these fees. While you're going to see some significant increase in a few of the fees, that isn't necessarily a concern for our development community. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Lawrence and Matt, who can also provide some opening comments, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Director Wagner, go ahead.
Through you, Chair Dimmers, to the members of council. Mike touched on many of the points. We really took a three-prong approach. Water, wastewater, as Mike said, was a 2-year study to look at the cost and the cost structure to make sure that we're capturing the costs, or at least assessing the costs that we should be charging for those users that consume or use up the resource. As you know, with inflation, our costs for a lot of our projects have gone up. Costs for materials, cost of overall labor costs as such. These are driving up some of these costs as well. And when we look at our regular user fees, we considered inflation. We looked at inflationary costs. I looked at what our historical numbers were for revenues generated from user fees. And I can say this, the last 2 years, essentially COVID has actually decimated what our revenues were. And in fact, right now, with the rate increases for our regular typical user fees, whether it be community services or finances, we're essentially flat to where we were a couple of years ago. Yet at the same time, our costs continue to rise. When it comes out to the planning and building rates and fees, I know it was a discussion with the former GBNF chair and vice chair and looking to find out whether our levy was covering costs that other users should pay for. So Mike alluded to making sure that costs are allocated to the right user group. In regards to planning and building, we looked at the cost and the cost recovery for those related fees and found that, the costs that we charged weren't actually indicative of the cost incurred to deliver those services. So what you see before you are reports, summary reports, a lot of time and effort to come in to understand that these items need to adjust to reflect the cost to provide the services, both to our residents and our external partners in the community. As Mike said, these, with regards to the builder community and such, this is not a concern. It's more rather to the fact is they're looking for turnaround in time. I think the approach we're taking to capture the cost and these reports are reflective of the costs incurred to deliver the services, and I support the direction. As Mike mentioned, we also actually layered a lot of these items into our budget. So when it comes to water, wastewater, those are built into our debt projections, built into our project costing model, built into our revenue sources and the like. So we try to make it an all-in approach when we're taking a look at these things and its linkages with other facets and things that affect the town. Thank you, Councillor Timbers.
Thank you very much, Director Wagner. Prior to proceeding, I will ask that council proceed with a majority vote to extend the speaking time for both presentations until each presentation is completed in accordance with the town's procedural bylaw. I have a motion moved by Councillor Murray that council extends the presentation time for both presentations until completed. I will now ask our deputy clerk to call the vote.
Thank you, Chair. And with a show of hands, may I have all those in favor, please? Thank you. And all those opposed? Thank you. That carries, Chair.
Thank you very much, Javan. We have presentations from Sean Michael Stephen, followed by Gary Scanlon and Byron Tan, all from Watson and Associates Economists presenting. Please go ahead.
We will get your presentation up. Just let us know when to advance the slide.
Great, thank you very much, and good evening, Chair and members of council. You can advance to the next slide. So in terms of the user fee review that we were retained to undertake, it focused on the planning, development, engineering, building permit, and clerks user fees that are imposed by the town. And within the objectives of the overall undertaking was to ultimately make fee recommendations, but in doing so, to first understand what is the full cost of service, and then in making those fee recommendations, doing so with regard for the governing legislation, ensuring those fees are defensible, and as well balancing the town's need to maximize cost recovery for those various services, while also decreasing the burden on the tax base and recognizing stakeholder interest in the affordability and competitiveness of the fees. So the key items I'll touch on in the presentation today include looking at the various legislative authorities for the different service areas, the methodology that was utilized to assess the full cost of review, and then the costing results and corresponding fee recommendations, which have been included in detail in the user fee report. Next slide, please. Next slide. So in terms of the legislative context, there's three different pieces of legislative authority for the various service areas. The first being the Planning Act, where Section 69 of the Planning Act allows municipalities to impose fees to recover the anticipated cost of processing each type of planning application. And that's pretty key to the methodology we've utilized, where it speaks to only the anticipated cost, as well as only the processing cost of applications, and as well needing to look at each type of application. So when municipalities impose fees to recover the cost of planning application review, and it can only look at those processing costs, and so it can't include things like costs of policy review and the defensive applications at the tribunal. And as well, when setting fees, there is not an ability to cross-subsidize your cost recovery through higher fees for subdivision applications, for example, to recover costs that you don't want to recover through minor variance applications. There's no appeal of the fees themselves under the Planning Act, but the fees are always in play and can be paid under protest and appealed to the tribunal. With building permit fees, so they're imposed under the authority of the Building Code Act. A little bit different in terms of the authority here, where fees can be imposed to recover the reasonable cost of administering and enforcing the code overall, allowing for the inclusion of direct, indirect, and capital costs. And so in contrast to the Planning Act, that level of cost recovery is set at the code level, and that's done intentionally to encourage compliance with the building permit process, while also allowing municipalities to recover those costs. So allowing municipalities to cross-subsidize their costs between fees for new residential building permit activity versus lower fees that may be imposed for minor residential deck permits to encourage compliance with that building permit review process. The Act also allows for Building Code Act reserve funds to be created, and we'll talk to that in a little bit more detail. And in terms of the public process, there is a public meeting requirement, which this meeting does represent for any change in building permit fees. And then lastly, on the next slide, in terms of the all other fees included in the scope of the review being development, engineering, and clerk's fees, they're imposed under Part 12 of the Municipal Act, Section 391. And again, the test here is a little bit more broad, where municipalities are able to impose fees for services that are provided. And the key test here is that the fees that are imposed do in fact need to be a fee for service and can't be a tax. And so if the municipality is seen to be operating outside their legislative authority, those fees can be appealed to the courts. Go ahead to the next two slides, looking at the methodology, first of all, that we utilized in assessing the full cost of service. So it was an activity-based costing methodology that we utilized, that's illustrated on the screen now. And so what we went through in a fair bit of detail and spent a considerable amount of time on with staff is actually starting on the right-hand side of the illustration, is first looking at what are the various categories of activities that we wanted to understand what the costs were. And so looking quite broadly at building permits, planning applications versus the other services like clerks and development engineering, not just looking at the cost of those programs in total, but drilling down a bit deeper to understand the cost of the different types of building permits, whether that be new low density residential building permits versus minor residential activity within planning applications, looking not just at the different types of planning applications, so a subdivision application versus a minor or a zoning bylaw amendment application, but even drilling down a bit deeper to understand what were the costs for different sizes of development proposals within those different application types, as well as looking at minor and major distinctions around application processing complexity. Once we determined those categories with staff for costing, then we worked with staff to define what is the individual processes that staff would proceed through in the review of those applications, and then who would also be involved in those processes to work with staff on estimating how much time they would typically spend across that mapped sequence of steps within a plan of subdivision application, for example. And then doing the due diligence to test that level of effort to make sure that when we apply those estimates to the annual volumes of planning applications or building permits that staff would be involved in, that annual level of effort was reasonable and reflective of the current levels of service and the staff complement that was in place. And so based on that annual level of utilization of the different staff positions from the various departments and divisions across the organization that would be involved in those review processes, so whether that be staff in planning or building or legislative services, for example, that annual utilization of staff is in the driver for how costs are allocated, not only for the resource costs being their salary, wage, and benefit costs, but also for the other departmental direct costs that are consumed in the delivery of those activities. And as well, and as you can see on the left-hand side of the illustration, accounting for the indirect support and overhead costs that are also required for those forward-facing direct service delivery functions to operate. So accounting for costs such as IT and HR and finance, and working with staff to develop the appropriate drivers for how those costs are consumed by those direct service delivery departments. Next slide, please. And again, please. So based on that approach that we utilized, the overall across those four service areas of building, clerks, planning, and development engineering, there was about 12.3 full-time equivalent staff positions utilized annually in those activities. As you can see in the inner circle of the pie chart, the majority of that time is spent on building permit review and planning application review within the dark blue section, about 5 FTs annually, or about 41% of the annual level of involvement relating to building permit review, and for planning application review in the orange section, about 5.8 full-time equivalent positions, or about 47% of that annual level of involvement related to planning application review. with then between clerk, engineering, and clerks, about 1.1 and 0.3 full-time equivalent positions respectively utilized in those service areas. And then in the outer circle of the pie chart, what's shown there then is within those 4 service areas, what are the main departments that were involved in those review activities? And so as you would expect, within building permit review, the majority of that involvement is provided by a building department staff, contribute 98% of, contributing about 85% of that overall level of involvement. And within planning application review, the planning department, again, as you'd expect, being the chief players in those review activities, contributing excuse me, the majority of that time, but also accounting for time from other staff such as technical, public works, environmental services staff, and other areas of the organization. And then last point to highlight there is looking at the involvement of planning department staff, they spend about 53% of their time on planning application review. And so just to highlight here that going back to the methodology on the earlier slide, what we have not looked at here is the annual cost of a department and just apportioning those over the applications that are reviewed to come up with those annual costs. We've looked specifically at the involvement of planning staff on those development review activities. So what this suggests is that there's still a significant portion of their annual time that is not being proposed to be recovered through planning application fees for the time that is spent on other areas like policy and defensive applications. Next slide, please. So based on that annual level of staff involvement, thank you. The annual level of staff involvement, the total cost annually across those 4 service areas is about $2.1 million. And the majority of those costs are for the direct costs of service, about 77% of those costs, with indirect and capital costs making up the remaining 19% and 4% of the annual cost respectively. And so that 19% of annual costs being related to the indirect overhead and support costs is well in line with the ranges we typically see in municipalities across the province, where indirect costs typically range somewhere between usually around 15 to 25% of the total cost of service. Next slide, please. So then, as we saw on the earlier slide, the total annual level of staff involvement, the majority of that was related to planning application and building permit review. And as such, we can see that here with the annual cost of service. A majority of those costs related to planning applications at just over $1 million, in building permit review, about $820,000 annually. Overall, across the 4 service areas, the current fees based on historical application volumes recover about $1.7 million in revenue, or about 80% of those costs. And we can see that that level of cost recovery varies a fair bit by service areas. So planning applications currently recovering about 44% of the annual cost of service, about $450,000, indicating that about $580,000 would currently be funded through municipal tax support. Looking at building permit review, the current fees are fully recovering that annual cost of service, and actually over recovering based on that historical application volumes. But that needs to be put in the context of not just the annual cost of administering and enforcing the code, but also the necessity to make sure that there are contributions to the Building Code Reserve Fund for future service sustainability, which we'll come back to in a few slides. Development engineering fees are generally recovering the full cost of service currently, and clerks fees are recovering about 47% of the $50,000 annually, or about $23,000 in user fee revenue. And with that lower level of cost recovery being somewhat anticipated, as there are certain activities within clerks fees that would be deemed to have more of a community benefit, and therefore not necessarily designed to be set at full cost recovery levels and have some level of municipal tax support. Next slide, please. So just briefly on the clerk's fees recommendations, which again are included in detail in the report, the fee recommendations that have been made are to increase fees to levels seen within the other area municipalities in the Niagara region, to remaining competitive within those other municipalities. And the result of those fee increases would improve overall cost recovery levels to 67%, adding an additional $10,000 approximately in additional user fee revenue per year. Next slide, please. Then moving on to planning application fees. So as we saw in the earlier slide, in aggregate, the current revenues are recovering about 44% of those costs. Now here we can see that broken down by major type of planning application. And so what's notable here is that the majority of the cost, just over 3/4 of the annual cost, are related to zoning bylaw amendment, site plan application, and committee of adjustment fees. And when we look at the level of cost recovery for those application types that represent the majority of that involvement in cost, those fees are only recovering about 34% of the annual cost of service. And as I mentioned earlier, committee of adjustment application fees are one area which you would anticipate a lower level of cost recovery because those fees are generally set below full cost recovery levels in municipalities. Lastly, with condominium and subdivision applications, those two application types, we see a slightly better level of cost recovery, recovering about 72%, 82% of those annual costs of service respectively. So based on that level of cost, a greater level of cost recovery, we wouldn't expect as significant fee increases required to move to full cost recovery levels for those application types. So before talking about the fee recommendations on the next slide, a couple of things to note in terms of the process that we went through in assessing the annual cost of service and the proposed fees. The annual costs and the current processes have been assessed based on the current development review processes in the town. And so any changes to those development review processes as a result of Bill 109 in terms of refund requirements for site plan and zoning bylaw amendment applications that aren't approved within the new legislated timeframes, or changes from Bill 23 with respect to regional approval authorities will be assessed further before the town considers any future implications on the development fees. And then when looking at the fee recommendations, again, they've been discussed in detail with staff and moved to either recover the full cost of service, or as I touched on, to move within market levels within the region, such as for committee of adjustment fees. And on the next slide, just to highlight a few of the key structural changes to the fee recommendations that have been made. Again, with the detailed fee recommendations included in the report. One item to highlight is that for zoning bylaw amendment and official plan amendment applications, those fees are currently imposed on a flat fee basis, or there's just one fee for each of those application types. What's being proposed is that there would now be minor and major fees imposed to recognize that there is differences in the types of applications that are received and the complexity of review. And so imposing fees to help recognize that the difference in marginal cost of processing. For site plan and subdivision applications, again, those fees are currently imposed on a flat fee basis. What's being proposed is to introduce a variable fee component to those application fees. So for site plan, in addition to the base application fee, there would be a per square meter fee charged on the gross floor area of the proposed development, and a per unit fee for subdivision applications. And with the intent here is to improve cost recovery levels, but doing so with regard for the increase in complexity and cost that's seen with larger applications. And so aligning the level of cost recovery with aligning the level of fee revenue with the cost of development review. Committee adjustment fees, as I touched on a couple times, for consent and minor variance applications would be imposed below full cost recovery levels at levels seen within the region. For pre-consultation fees, similar to the official plan and zoning bylaw amendment fees, there would be major and minor pre-consultation meeting fees imposed. And then lastly, for subdivision official plan and zoning bylaw amendment fees that are received or those applications are received concurrently, there would be fee policies in place to provide for fee discounts to recognize the economies of scale in the development review process when reviewing those applications received concurrently. On the next slide, for development engineering fees, as I mentioned, the current revenues are generally recovering the full cost of service. As we can see, the engineering and inspection fees represent the majority of the cost of service, about 94% of the annual cost at $206,000 of the total of about $219,000 in annual cost. So other than inflationary increases to the fees, there's no proposed changes to the development engineering fees. Then moving forward to building permit fees. Again, similar to the presentation on the earlier slides for planning and development engineering, you can see the total annual cost of service broken down by major building permit type and the associated levels of cost recovery. And as I mentioned earlier, what we commonly see in municipalities is some cross-subsidization of that cost recovery between the fees for new residential and non-residential building permits in comparison to the fees for minor residential additions, alterations, and other minor permits. So, for example, we can see here the majority of the annual cost of service are for those residential permits, with about half of the cost being for new residential, medium, and low density permits, which are actually recovering about $613,000 annually, or about 142% of the annual cost. Those surpluses offsetting the losses being incurred on the minor residential permit activity, where the annual cost of $200,000 compared to revenue about $85,000. And so one thing to note as we move forward to look at the building permit fee recommendations is that when looking at that historical level of cost recovery, that's premised on the average historical building permit activity. When we look at the fee recommendations, those have been assessed in the context of the anticipated building permit activity, not only in an aggregate, but as well by type of development. And so the fee recommendations, again, are looking at recovering the full cost of administering and enforcing the building code, but then as well for providing contributions to the building permit reserve fund to allow for the future sustainability of the delivery of the services. And so the rationale for contributing to building permit reserve funds is premised around, first of all, the fact that the Building Code Act explicitly allows for the creation of those reserve funds. And when that was put into place, that was at the same time that municipalities were required to have certified building code officials, as well as statutory turnaround time, thereby tightening that labor market. And so municipalities need to have a reserve fund in place to maintain that service capacity during economic downturns, so that when building permit activity returns and the associated revenues with those, they were able to maintain the service capacity in terms of their building permit staff to continue to provide that function. And so the reserve fund policy that was developed through the comprehensive review of the town's user fees that was undertaken previously was to achieve a maximum balance of 2 times annual direct costs. And that approach is generally consistent with the strategies that are utilized across the province as well as within the region. And so on the next slide, when looking at the recommendations, they've been made to, again, achieve that target reserve fund multiple over a 5-year period, so by 2027, while also having regard for the competitiveness of those individual building permit fees within Niagara region. And so I think what's important to highlight here is that when looking at the forecast of costs and revenues, again, that's been done in the context of the anticipated development activity and that's being informed by the forecast of development activity within the region's official plan, specifically for the town within that official plan forecast. And what's seen in that forecast of development activity is a shift towards more medium density residential dwelling unit development versus a much greater share of low density residential permits historically. And with that shift, we see shifts in the associated levels of cost covered by permit type. And so although in the earlier slides, we saw the current fees recovering greater than the full cost of service, when we look at that forecast amount and mix of development activity, there still would be fee increases required. And so the increases that have been proposed are across the non-residential fees, which are generally much lower than the fees imposed in the surrounding municipalities, a 25% increase this year, and for residential fees, a 7% increase. And then in the following years, inflationary increases to those fees only, consistent with the increases in the town's operating budget. Next slide, please. And so just to illustrate those revenue increases and that reserve fund strategy graphically, we can see on the bottom portion of this graph the annual expenses in the light red section and revenues in green. You can see annually the revenues be anticipated to be greater than the annual expenses. And with that, those surpluses allowing for the accumulation of reserve funds to move from the current multiple of about 1.2 times annual direct costs, or about $800,000 current reserve fund balance, up to that 2 times multiple by 2027, roughly $1.6 million. And then, so on the following slide, then what we find quite helpful to do for council as well is to put the impacts of the planning, application, and building permit fee recommendations in the broader context of what does this mean for the overall cost of municipal development fees, and doing so for a variety of development types to understand what this means for different development types in terms of residential versus non-residential, but as well as size of developments and density. So we've looked at for 4 sample development types, what the total fees would be for planning application, building permits, as well as development charges. And so looking at a larger and smaller residential development, whether that be 100-unit low density development or 25-unit medium density development, and then for a smaller retail development versus a larger non-residential development going through a site plan. And so in the table on the bottom of the slide, what's highlighted here are the total planning and building permit fees under the current fee structure versus the proposed increases. And as you can see, for looking at just the planning and building permit fees in isolation, the recommendations would see between a 10 and 20% increase in the total fees for the 2 residential types, and greater increases for the non-residential types, between a 30 and 97% increase in those planning application and building permit fees. But then on the far right-hand side of the table, we can see those impacts when put in the context of the total development fees payable. The 10, almost 11% increase in the planning and building permit fees for the low density subdivision would only represent about a 0.6% increase in the total development fees payable, including development charges. And we can see other fairly nominal increases for the 25-unit medium density condominium and the larger industrial site plan development. Then we do see a greater overall impact for the smaller retail development, where the development charges represent a much smaller share of that overall cost of municipal development fees. And then lastly, to highlight that within the proposed planning and building permit fees, in each case, in terms of these sample developments, the total planning and building permit fees would be lower than the highest comparator in the area municipalities within the region. So looking at these increases would still put the region or the town's current fees below that top end of the regional comparators. And so on the following slides, I won't go through each one of these slides in detail. They are presented here as well as in the report, but just to highlight for you what's included here is showing you that this first graph being for the 100-unit low density subdivision development, just highlighting that the building permit and planning application fees represent a very small share of that total cost of municipal development. As you can see, the dark blue section representing development charges, with for the town, the planning and building permit fees representing less than 7% of those total costs. And then on the following three slides, the illustrations are provided for the other three development samples. And in each case, the planning and building permit fees represent a fairly small share of the total cost of municipal development. And with the proposed fee increases, the position of the town relative to the other municipalities in the region would remain unchanged. And so you want to move ahead a few slides to the summary slide. So then lastly, as we talked about somewhat throughout and in the introductory comments, part of the intent of looking at these user fees across these four service areas is to help balance the recovery of the cost the town is currently incurring, and looking at that balance between that recovery coming from the direct beneficiaries of service versus being paid for by more generally through the municipal taxes. And so with the proposed planning application fees, what would be seen as about 108% increase in annual planning application fee revenue. So an increase of about $488,000 annually, moving planning application fees up to about 91% cost recovery. Building permit fees would continue to recover the full cost of service, but within those annual revenues, what would be included is about $168,000 that would be attributable not to the direct cost of service, but to the indirect support costs. And in comparison to the current indirect cost of service, so for those areas like general governance, HR, finance, that are currently being funded from building permit revenues, this would represent about a $54,000 increase. So again, that $54,000 being offsetting costs that are currently being funded through the municipal levy. There'd be no change to development engineering fees and about $10,000 in additional revenue from the proposed clerk's fees. So overall, across the four service areas, we have about $550,000 in additional annual revenue available to offset current municipal tax funding. So that does conclude my presentation. I am available if there are any questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Sean Michael. I'm going to open it up for questions, and I see Councillor Bernay, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Timmers. So I guess, going through this presentation, it's obvious in a lot of these areas we have some shortfall, we have some deficits. So I guess, in the opening comments, our CAO said we're playing catch up. So I guess my first question when I look at these deficits, it's how long has it been since we've done a comprehensive review on these planning and permit fees?
Okay, thank you, Councillor Renee. Were you directing that, sorry, to CAO or to Director Wagner?
Anybody that can answer it.
Okay, sorry, I didn't hear what you said originally. Director Wagner.
Through you, Chair Timmers, that's a great question, Councillor. I honestly can't answer it. I know that we've historically built up our costing model. We've just adjusted them over the period of time. It hasn't been done since I've arrived, so I know it precedes me, but I don't think this type of analysis and this level of detail, this connectivity with reserves, this connectivity with our capital plan and the like has been done to date, to be quite honest with you. but Matt may have other comments in that regards.
Thank you. I see Director Bruder, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, I just wanted to offer a little bit of additional context. I actually had this conversation earlier with our chief building official, just in terms of, how far this goes back to when there was a fulsome review. And since 2006, when he started, a review hadn't been done either. So it was definitely long overdue, but I just want to provide that insight that I gained today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. And I see our CAO. I'm going to go back to Mike. Go ahead, please.
Through you, Chair Chambers, maybe just offer a little bit of, further insight. Every year, we're always looking at our fees and we're looking at increases. And we've made small incremental increases in various elements of the fees we charge. What we haven't done, I think, is tie it back and with this type of analysis, Councillor Brunet. So great question. I agree. What we hadn't done is tie it back again to the budget and really have Watson go through it with a level of detail. Watson, on a very regular basis, is looking at our rates, our fees, our water and wastewater studies, development charges, and most of the other things we do. So it predates me as well in terms of the last time we did this, in terms of integrating it to this level. Albeit, though, I do want to just put council at ease that we are looking at fees on a yearly basis, just not this type of analysis that really, I think, took us 2 years. And really, makes the connections and ties it back at a level that is this detailed.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Councillor Brunet. So
yeah. Thank you, Chair Timmers. I mean, I appreciate those comments, but quite honestly, I got to say, I'm shocked to see the deficits in some of these areas, like that we're only recovering 44%, and there's a deficit of 577 on $1 million. To me, that's shocking. And we talk about cost recovery, and we talk about keeping it off our levy. I would have thought this would have been on our radar a long time ago, but I digress. Through you, Chair, I'm wondering, through to Sean Michael, it's obvious we need to increase these rates. It's painfully obvious. But from your perspective, dealing with municipalities across Ontario, do municipalities normally go into discussions with the builder and development community, the industry, when they're looking at making these types of significant increases in rates?
Through the chair, thank you for the question. Often they do. Whether that's specifically through a dedicated consultation as part of the fee review process, or often it's just as part of those regular discussions that planning and development departments and municipalities are having with their building industry representatives. So I would say, yes, it might occur formally, or it might occur as part of their regular consultations.
Thank you for that response. And Chair Timmers, if I could just ask one more question, please.
Yep, go ahead, Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. So I know on the slide, Sean Michael, you definitely had something there that was indicating that potentially some of these rates are a relation or a correlation to maybe some of the changes that are happening with Bill 23. But I'm wondering through to staff, either to our CEO or to Mr. Bruder, if that is, one of the underlying things here is that we feel that due to the changes, maybe some staffing at the region, that maybe more of this work is going to have to be done in-house, that is also an impetus into some of these significant rate changes.
Thank you, Councillor. Who wants to take a stab? I see Matt's taking himself off. Director Bruder, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And I think, just generally speaking, lately with development as a whole, especially some of the applications we've been seeing over the past couple of years, even notwithstanding some of these policy changes, things are getting a little bit more complex, just by virtue of the growth policies, the provincial policies, and the development concepts that are coming out of that. A lot more infill, a little bit more compact built form. We've seen in the past year some densities that are coming in a bit higher than what our secondary plans had envisioned just even a couple of years back. All of that requires more rigor, and I think that's definitely reflected here in terms of, you know, some of the larger increases you see with, you know, land use changes, official plans, zoning, site plans. Those things are more complex than they ever have been. And then now moving forward with some of the planning changes you're speaking about, Councillor Brunet, yeah, I mean, now there's going to be an impetus to process things a little quicker as well. I think, you know, there probably is some further analysis that needs to happen as those policies proceed further, as everybody knows here. And I've got some more updates coming at another meeting, but, you know, things are still kind of in flux with Bill 23, especially in terms of how it all shakes out in certain aspects. So, you know, further evaluations needed, but I think this is just indicative of, you know, the more complex nature of development in general and the staff resources and time that need to ensure, you know, that we get it right and we're achieving the best possible planning outcome.
Yeah,
Thank you very much, Director Bruder. Councillor Brunet?
Yeah, Chair Timmers, I wanted to thank staff, and I want to thank Watson for all the work that's gone into. This is a very, very comprehensive review, probably one that's long overdue. And I think the information and the detail we're getting here is very, very critical. And so thank you for everyone's efforts on this. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Brunet, and I agree totally with your comments there. I see our CAO has his hand up as well. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Chair. Through to Councillor Brunet in his specific question. You know, we're going to be in front of council probably over the next number of months as these bills and the elements of these bills that take away responsibilities from the region and give it to us receive royal assent and become legislation. And I know the region, both at a planning level as well as at a CAO level, is talking about the provision of the services that we currently rely on the region to do and what that looks like and who's going to pay for all of that stuff. So I think, Council, a simple answer to your question, is this reflective of Bill 23 and that's where the charges are coming from? No. I think this is, you know, as I said in my opening comments, a little bit of catch up. And I think like a few other studies, you know, when we were talking about just a review of compensation and how we compare, and you made the comment that we should be doing this more regularly. You know, I asked Gary, how often should these things be done? Probably every 3 to 4 years is what we should be looking at. So while I think we're behind and this hasn't happened, you know, probably in double that time frame, you know, it should be something we look at more regularly.
Thank you very much, Mike. I have Councillor Regima in the queue. Please go ahead, Councillor.
Thank you, Chair Timmers. Thanks very much for the presentation and all the work again gone into the report. I think it's well done, and it really it helps us really have a look at where our costs are and where they should be, and it's a bit of a reality check. So some of these planning application fees increases. So, you know, I appreciate how it was laid up to us and how it's really clear that in the long term, for example, for a developer that takes an application, takes a development from pre-consultation all the way to building permits and development charges stage, it's for that sample development, it really just represents a 0.6% increase for them. You know, and I'm just gonna, this is just really a comment. I do have a question, but this is really just a comment on impact. So not every developer starts at pre-consultation, takes it all the way to the end. Some may just do a zoning amendment and then sell the property. So it's going to be, I would say, considerable impact for them, some of these fee increases, but if they're necessary, they're necessary, because obviously we have to recover our fees, or our costs, I should say. So my question is, with the additional revenue of, it was just over $500,000 that we're expecting to have as a result of these fee increases, was that taken into consideration in the recent draft budget? I guess that's a question through to Lawrence.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Through to Director Wagner.
Through you, Chair Timmers, to Councillor Regima. Yes, it was. And it's also been considered in relation to the reserves, the different funding sources, the activities, similar to water. when we're looking at the water wastewater, we built that in as well to kind of figure out what the numbers look like. Because I think it is very important to layer all of these things together because it is one tide or one closed system.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor. Next, we have Councillor Mikulik. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Chair Timmers, through you to the presenter. I'm just curious with regards to these fees and how does, there's a chart that you had with how we are relative to other municipalities in the region. And I'm feeling like large industry is looking at studies or comparators. How does these fees, in terms of soft costs with development, where does this put us, in a provincial sort of landscape? If we're trying to attract large industrial or retail development or redevelopment.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm looking for, Director Wagner or Matt, who wanted to take a stab at that?
I can try and address that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, it's like Sean. Absolutely, go ahead.
So, so I think if you're looking at that across the province more generally, I think what if you're to look at the cost of planning application review in terms of the fees that are imposed, what you'll generally see is that those fees are typically higher in the GTA municipalities where they have through the types of development intensification they're seeing, they have some additional complexities of review that add to their costs that are recovered through those average application fees. So I couldn't speak to specifically where that puts you across the entire GTA or province, but the fees are below the top end of the municipalities within Niagara region, which I know are below the majority of those fees that are imposed across the GTA.
I just trying to compare ourselves to other municipalities. Thank you for that response. That are more comparative to us, let's say. It's just I'm I'm concerned about like the cost with industrial. These are the types of developments that create jobs, and if we're not competitive in for larger manufacturers and larger corporations are looking at everything, at the total picture. So,
Councillor, I'm just going to interject here. I see Director Wagner would like to respond, so he's got his hand up. So I'll refer to him now. Go ahead,
through your Chair Timmers to Councillor Mikulik. I would caution against just doing a simple comparison to the rate structures of your local area municipality. I won't argue the fact is it may be a consideration point for somebody looking at the cost in comparison to another municipality, but the exercise we undertook was to try to understand the activity costs going in to provide the services to those areas. I would suggest and possibly say that unless all of the other municipalities have done this type of fulsome review, their cost structure, what you're basing it on and trying to compare on, may be light. And in fact, they should be charging more, but they're leaving it on the levy side. The exercise was to try to make sure we were covering the cost, not to burden our residents and such. So I just caution to when you look at your comparators when it comes to this, without actually using the same apples to apples comparison or ensuring that the same rigor was applied on cost structures and cost reviews. It's a tough one to respond to fully, Councillor.
Appreciate that further. Perhaps through you, if I could follow up with that to our economic development officer, if he could weigh in and see what his thoughts are. My guess is that there would be no need for CIPs or anything of that nature, tax incentive grants, if we're going down this road of increasing. Some of the increases are quite substantial.
Councillor, over to go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to the councillor. So Councillor Mikulik, I mean, good question. At the end of the day, cost is always a factor when it comes to trying to attract additional investment, when it comes to industrial, commercial, those sort of developments. But at the end of the day, I know our businesses look at other factors that aren't necessarily just financial. They look at access to labor. They look at access to transportation corridors. They look at how fast our planning department will process the applications and how quickly they can get into the ground. All things that I think we excel on and we exceed on. So at the end of the day, cost is a factor, but there's things they look at that aren't necessarily just costs. In addition, I know development charges are something that we hear a lot about when it comes to development and trying to attract industrial development and commercial development to our community. I know something that we're talking about, things that the province is looking at when it comes to development charges as well. So things that we would obviously want to talk about when it comes to CIPs, those sort of things. But at the end of the day, I think, when it comes to just cost, it's not just one factor. There's a whole myriad of things that development looks at, things that we do excel on. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Deanne. Councillor Mikulik, I see our CAO has his hand up, so I'm going to go to him now. Go ahead, Mike. You're on mute.
I'm on mute. Sorry. Through you, Chair Timmers, to the councillor. In a lot of ways, I think this question we anticipated, Councillor Mikulik. I know you and I have spoken briefly, but so earlier today, Director Bruder, Ms. Shi and I were at a meeting, and we met with a few developers / builders who do commercial, residential, and industrial. And I posed this very question to them. We talk to them regularly. Fees is not something that's come up. However, I think one of the things that we posed to them was, what drives your decision making? Is an increase in fees going to be one of those decisions that causes you to look elsewhere? And I think what they said very clearly, and Director Bruder can, further elaborate on this, was the fees is really a small part. There's larger things happening both at a national and global level. And so really they talked about, interest rates, the cooling of the economy, the labor force, and the cost of materials that are the largest driver. Now, that's not to say they're fine with exorbitant fees or fees going up for municipalities or development charges going up like we've seen. And so again, I think, it's a small part. I think it may be sticker shock when we look at it, but to a lot of the developers, and I posed the question today to many that and that most of council knows and that do business across Niagara, their issue was more around some of these broader issues. So Matt may want to chime into that or validate that, but I leave council with that particular comment. And I'll go back to to my previous comment. Rates have increased in the past. Some of it was done through indexing. And so I think, indexing with inflation, probably appeared reasonable to them, probably appeared reasonable to us. These are exercises we should be doing more often.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you.
Are you good?
I have another question with regards to
go ahead.
Projections and like last year, like I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but in terms I used the wastewater and water study, and there was 38 new units that were built that I'm aware of that required new water, new servicing. That leads me to believe new sort of construction. Is there any concern? That seems rather low to me. And is there any concern about our numbers or our forecasted numbers, the accuracy of them based on the times that we're currently in and that we're hearing about that maybe in the future? I'm thinking this report was drawn up maybe several months ago. How fluid is this report?
Thank you, Councillor. I see Director Wagner has his hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Timmers and the members of council. I'm sure Sean Michael can respond or also Matt. But we did look at forecasts. We looked at historical numbers. We looked at projections. But this is similar to the reserve study and such. I think these things have to be reviewed on a regular, more let's say not an extended period, every couple of years, similar to the reserves or reserve balances and such. Businesses change, economies change and such. And my intent is to look at these types of items when it comes to fiscal sustainability and forecast, to test them out every once in a while. Matt talked about Bill 109, Bill 23. Those are going to have some potential significant changes, or maybe not. But, you know, when those come through and those changes we're no more, we'll take a look at this again. And I would expect we continue to look at these kind of things, because you don't want to do this for a protracted amount of time, 10 years, 15 years, without taking another close look at it. So I would expect, and my hope is to continue to look at them on a regular basis, periodic, obviously not every year, because a lot of things don't change that quick, but every couple of years I think would suffice, and we should be able to capture things and adjust. What actually buttresses us or saves us as well is we have a reserve. We have a reserve balance set up to maintain. We will also have an indicator to see if these things are not necessarily returning into the reserves and maintaining that level. I will know we have a gap, because I know what the balance should be. So I think I put in some indicators and such to help give us some of those forewarning and such. But again, my commitment is to try to do this on a more regular basis.
Great. Thank you, Director Wagner. Councillor Mikulik, I also see Sean Michael has his hand up, so I'm going to go to him now for comment.
Thank you, Chair. And actually, I think Lawrence addressed most of what I was going to add there in the sort of his ending comments, but yeah, just to sort of build on that a little bit, where changes in anticipated development activity in terms of which services could have an impact on fee recommendations, it doesn't impact planning application fees. So they've been assessed on a per application basis. So it could have an impact on obviously annual costs and annual revenues, but it wouldn't impact the fees that are being proposed. Where the change in development activity has potentially more of an impact is on building permit fees, where those fees have been assessed in the context of the sustainability of that reserve. And so as Mr. Wagner pointed out, that you are starting from a fairly healthy reserve fund position for your building permit reserve. So if there is a downturn in building permit activity in comparison to what is anticipated, that's something that staff would be monitoring annually. There is some reserves there to account for some decrease in revenues, but to the extent that is more prolonged in terms of decreases versus what is anticipated, then that would be monitored and could necessitate more interim adjustments to the proposed fees.
Thank you very much, Sean Michael. Okay, Councillor Mikulik, are you good?
If I could get one more, my third question.
Okay, go ahead.
So following up on the significant increases in some of these, like they were quite eye-popping for myself. Was there any consideration to phasing in, like a phased in implementation, like rather than an all at once? Like sticker shock sort of a thing, like where you go from a reduced, maybe we were giving ourselves away too cheap one day, and then all of a sudden now here we are. Was there any consideration to a phased in approach?
Thanks, Councillor. Sean Michael, go ahead.
Sure, through the chair, I can address that, and if Matt wants to jump in, that's great as well. So we didn't consider a phase-in, and the reason we didn't is because sort of a couple reasons. One is, from our experience doing this elsewhere, the current level of cost recovery that you're seeing and the fee increases to move the full cost recovery levels are not unusual for municipalities that haven't undertaken a comprehensive review before. So we commonly see levels of cost recovery around 30%, 40% for planning application fees where municipalities haven't done this before. And through our experience doing this, municipalities have been able to move to full cost recovery levels often, probably more often than not, in one go instead of phasing in. And there hasn't been overly significant pushback from the development community, because as was highlighted earlier, when it comes to planning application fees, what we typically hear is the concern is much more around processing time and levels of service versus the actual fees that are imposed. So it's somewhat secondary to what the main concerns are that we hear.
Thank you, Sean Michael. I see Director Bruder has his hand up. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. Just to echo Sean Michael's comment, because I've heard that before in my communications with many different developers of varying sizes, their consultants, that is their focus. Actually, I've often heard, even as Bill 109 is upon us and speeding up some of these timelines, and some of the pressures on the departments that can result moving forward, that again will require further evaluation. But their comments have been, raise the fees if you have to. It's all about, the priority is getting answers, getting them quick, and getting more of them because of all the multifaceted considerations with planning applications these days that I was referring to earlier. So from my experience and what I'm hearing around the industry, Sean Michael's exactly right.
Thank you, Matt. Councilor Quick?
That's it for now. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to move on to Councilor Russell. Thanks for your patience there, Councilor. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That was a lot of questions, but that's okay.
I thought it was well more than 3 in my mind. But
it was a bonus.
I lost count.
I'm going to ask one, and it's going to be hopefully relatively quick, to our CAO or potentially to Mr. Bruder. I'm just wondering, has there been, again, as Bill 23 eventually kind of rolls out and we start getting some more detail on what the impacts are going to be, eventually there will be a forecast on what those impacts are going to be on each municipality. I know a lot of it is targeted towards affordable housing or attainable housing, long-term rentals, very, very streamlined, but eventually we are going to get to a point, and all the municipalities are going to get to a point where we have a number of what it's going to do. I'm wondering, has there been any discussion amongst the municipalities? And this is why I'm asking the CAO first, because I know he has a lot of CAO calls. Has there been any discussion, opposite of what Councillor Mickle was talking about, of us raising, or municipalities raising their development charges directly to offset those potential losses that they're going to see as a result of Bill 23? Like, have a concerted effort where a number of municipalities do the same thing. I know it's probably counteractive to what the province is trying to do, but in terms of cost recovery and benefit to our residents, by lessening the impact of those burdens, I wonder if that's been discussed at all.
Councilor, to our CAO, Mike. Go ahead.
Through Chair Timmers to the Councillor. Councillor, I think the simple answer is yes, a lot of things have been discussed amongst, not just Niagara Region CAOs, but more broadly city managers and CAOs across the province on how to address that shortfall. And some of it may, comes through raising of fees. Some of it, we're going to be, very, I think, limited on what we can do relative to development charges, but there are other ways that we can collect fees, and there are other services and provisions that need to be completed in order for us to process applications. And so those are a lot of the conversations happening right now. How do we start to have those conversations much earlier in the process with developers? Right now, we have what we call pre-consultation meetings, and those are just conversations. I think we're going to start making sure that those pre-consultation meetings are almost like first submissions, so that we can meet those particular timelines and start charging fees for them. And again, I'm going to reiterate, it isn't the fees that are driving some of our developers to have concerns. Timing, the level of service they receive, how that service is structured, and do they get, quick processing of applications and items moving forward. Those are things they care about more, and we are a small piece of that pie. The largest costs are development charges. They are other things that developers are paying that inevitably the resident buying the house is paying because they're passing it on. And we heard that again today. I had this very conversation in anticipation of this evening that council would ask this particular question. We are a small piece of the pie, an important piece of the pie in terms of moving things forward. But I think, that's a long-winded answer to say yes, councillor. We are having those conversations, less on the DC side because we're going to be limited, but more on the other fees that we can charge.
Thank you very much, I see Director Bruder has his hand up as well, councillor. So I'll go to Matt.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, just to kind of build off of that a little bit, just in terms of how we identify what development charges are when we undertake our development charge studies, there's a lot of factors that go into that. We look at service levels, we look at projects necessary and all these things, and the developments and growth in the pipeline. So I guess I'm just saying that to say it's not as simple as, okay, well, we're going to have all these impacts. Okay, we're going to rate, increase development charges by X amount. There's going to be a lot of considerations that go into that. I think, as this unfolds, there could be potential for that to make up for some of the changes that are happening it's a little bit too early to tell, but I just wanted to say there's a science behind it too that will still have to be maintained. So how Bill 23 slots into that, we're still working through the mechanics.
Thank you, Director Bruder. Councillor Russell?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you very much to everybody.
Excellent. Thank you, Councillor. And I see Councillor Regina, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to make it's a comment, not a question, but I think it's important to note. And it's a compliment to what's going on here as well, that we're spending a fair amount of time talking about major developers, and that's what we often think about because those are the applications that we spend a lot of time looking at and planning meetings. But there are smaller quote unquote developers or applicants or customers, I guess, that we do have on a regular basis that might just come in for a rezoning for, something that they need for their home. So as I said earlier on, this is impactful to them. But what is good is how it's proposed to break up the application costs, fees into minor and major zoning applications and site plans according to square footage. And I think that helps. And so I appreciate that. And I wanted to comment on that.
Okay, thank you, Councillor.
Thank you.
Okay, so we do have a second presentation. So we're going to move into that now, the water and wastewater rate study with Gary Scanlon, and also Fire and Tan. If you could, yeah, absolutely, there they are. Whoever's going to go first, if you'd like to proceed, thank you.
Thank you. We'll get your presentation loaded. Just let us know when to advance the slide.
Sounds great. Thank you, Madam Chair. It's always a pleasure to be before council. The presentation tonight is very similar to a presentation we made 5 or 6 months ago. So really, to some extent, it's a recap of what we've presented, and so we'll go through and the next slide again would be in one more. There you go. So as I noted, in about 6 months ago, we were before council. We went through a very detailed process with staff, taking a look at the capital needs that both in constructing new infrastructure to accommodate growth. Obviously, without water and wastewater infrastructure, lands cannot be brought on stream. You need the infrastructure in place before you can basically receive a building permit. So it's very important to consider the development charge infrastructure. So we've looked not only at that, but we've also looked at, there's another piece of legislation, which is the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act. And with that, I'm sure you've had dialogue with staff, but the province is moving us towards doing long-term asset management planning and planning for the future for the replacement of the key infrastructure in order to ensure that it functions and performs into the future. So by 2025, all of that work is supposed to be done. That work, especially in the area of water and wastewater, would then get uploaded into another piece of legislation, which is the Water Opportunities Act. Now, Water Opportunities Act is laying the foundation for us to do full cost recovery for water and wastewater, and to ensure that the municipalities are doing the right things to continue to perform and keep the public safe and the environment safe with that infrastructure. So anyway, there's a lot of legislation behind all of this, and we've worked with staff and have incorporated those needs and those assumptions into this calculation. So to recap what we were looking at before in July, the rate forecast that we were presenting, we were looking at increased costs for capital, and that has been going up quite significantly. All municipalities across Ontario. So the infrastructure is increasing. Obviously, operating budgets are increasing as well, the cost of labor, with supply chain issues, some of the cost of materials, et cetera. We're looking at, there were some refinements identified by staff from what we had in the development charge to better suit the developments as they're proceeding. So there are some scope changes in some of the infrastructure. The asset management plan I talked about. The DC, the development charge update study, we've recently have gone through to update it. I think further we'll have to consider a revisit of that, let's say in 2 years. What will need to be addressed is the some of the projects I'll identify as well. We're with the region, well, first with the province setting new goals, and then the region going through to identify where development would occur. Your official plan needs to be updated in order to embrace that growth. Where is it going to be located? Is it intensification? Is there a heavy reliance on the Prudhome's area or other areas of the municipality? So there will be additional updates to the development charge that will need to be considered. We'd probably be looking at that somewhere in the range of 2024. The last thing is that we will be, as you'll see shortly, in funding this infrastructure, there is a sizable amount of debt that will be issued, and these rate increases are also trying to assist in reducing the amount of debt, because you'll rapidly hit your maximums. So we're trying to balance between rate increases and the amount of actual debt you'll incur for the infrastructure. With the debt, we're looking at longer term financing for the water and the wastewater. Previously, you were looking at 20-year financing. We may be considering 30 years. And obviously, most recently with even today, there was another bump in interest rates. Not only is the amount of borrowing increasing, but now the cost of borrowing is increasing. So once again, there's a number of different things that are being faced not only by your municipality, but other municipalities across Ontario. So we just wanted to summarize and update the calculations. It's marginally different from what we presented in July, very, very minor adjustments. So we thought we would come back and overview this for you. Next slide. This is just as a refresher. We have your current rate structures. You can see on the left, this is the water rates, and on the right-hand side, there's the wastewater. So you have two components to your charge for a resident. The one is a monthly charge, which here it's actually reflected as a quarterly charge, but that charge is fixed. And it varies by the size of the meter, but basically the charge is a fixed charge. And whether you're down in Florida for 3 months of the year and you're not using any of the water, you're still making a contribution towards the infrastructure and the maintenance of the system, because when you come back, you expect that it's functioning effectively for the rest of the year. So 85% of Ontario municipalities use a fixed charge, similar to what you have. And then on top of that, you can see there's a volume charge, and that charge is based on the amount of water that moves through the meter. So the water bill will then vary as a result of the amount of consumption. And you can see there's a volume charge for wastewater as well. We use the water meter as a surrogate for imposing the charge. And right now you've got a two-part charge. You have for most of the year from September to May, you have a volume charge of $2.49. And then you reduce that through the summer months. So June, July, and August, you drop it down to $1.87 basically. And that's kind of to reflect, well, even though you may be using more water during the summer months for lawn watering, etc., you're giving a bit of a discount on the wastewater side, because not all of that water is going back down through the sewers. So these are basically the charges that are in place. There are some additional charges here for those that are on flat rate that don't have a meter, and then for those water haulers there's a charge as well. But basically, all of these charges make up the revenue in order to fund the two systems. Next slide. And again, please. So once again, just, go back one. There you go. So I think I've gone through a lot of the background, the detail, how we've got to here. We've worked diligently with staff. They've been fantastic. I think it was a good interaction between ourselves and finance and public works in order to develop the plans and in order to take a look at the operating costs. As I've noted, some of the things we'll have to do in the future, obviously with the region's updated official plan, we'll have to update the forecast in your official plan. That will probably translate into additional infrastructure for water and wastewater that'll be needed. And that additional infrastructure will then need to be reflected in your development charge study. So we'd be looking to update that generally over the next 2 years. And with that, we'll look to update the rate study as well, because there'll be additional burdens, especially with some of the write-offs we're facing as a result of Bill 23. Increase in capital spending translates into potentially some additional lost revenue, and we'll have to incorporate that into the rates. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through obviously the detail, but we just wanted to demonstrate that there's a lot of capital that's been identified. Some of it, as I've noted, is replacement, more of the asset management. These pipes have an average useful life, and some of them are reaching the end of their life, or their performance isn't as good as it has been in the past. With the green items that have been highlighted, those are additional capital infrastructure that will be needed to accommodate additional growth. So this is what we've identified to date. With the update of the official plan, there's probably more capital that'll be included in here to accommodate growth. So in total, we're talking $50 million in infrastructure costs over the next 10 years. And if we look at, or I guess the next 8 years, and if we look on the wastewater side, which is the next slide, you can see similarly, we have a sizable amount of spending. It's about $40 million, just under $40 million. And you can see there's a number of projects that are replacement, which is at the upper part of the table. The growth related is at the bottom. And the green are additional works that we have to recover through the development charge study. Next slide. When we look at the funding of that 50 million for water and 40 million for wastewater, you can see there are some grants that will be available. There's not a lot of grant programs available. So if you can get some grants, you're in a very positive position. So the grants on the water side account for somewhere in the range of probably 7%. And on the wastewater side, it's only about 3%. Not a big dollar amount, but obviously every little bit helps. As we move down, you can see the next couple of columns or next couple of lines relate to debenture requirements. So on the water side, there's almost $5 million in non-growth and about $13 million in growth-related debentures. Now, we would hope that the growth-related is recoverable as much as possible through the through DCs. On the wastewater side, you can see we have another almost $22 million worth of debenturing. So this is where I was pointing out we have a sizable amount of debt that is expected solely for water and wastewater in the coming years. And we've tried to balance that by also increasing the transfers into the reserves so that we're funding it. So we're taking the money from the water rates, putting it into the reserves, and then pulling it back out to fund the capital. And we do that in order to try and smooth the rate increases from year to year. So we're trying to do it in a fashion that we're not getting these big up and down every year. So we're trying to smooth out the rates. So you can see there'll be $30 million on the water side. So 60% of it's recoverable really from rates that transfer into the reserves. And then we're probably about 50% of the charge on like the wastewater from those reserves. So a sizable amount that's going to have to be recovered immediately, through debenturing, and then transfers into the reserve funds. Next slide. So, and I'll show you some tables in a moment, but what we have done is continued with the same type of rate structure. So we're looking at that, continuing that fixed charge, as well as in combination with that, a volume charge. So we're looking at increases in those charges over time. So they'll increase on average about $16 per year for residential customers, for water, and then $14 on the wastewater side. And then when we're looking at the volume increases, you can see that, in the early part of the forecast, it'll be about 56 cents per year for the first couple of years. And then once we get to a certain point, we'll be able to slow down those increases, and it'll be running at about 9 cents per year, the increase for the volume consumption. On the wastewater side, very, very similar. We're looking at about 58 cents increase per cubic meter per year. And then once we hit 2027 and onwards, there's a slowing down of those rate increases. So because a lot of the expenditures are in the early part of the forecast, we have to step up a little faster the increases on the rates. Next slide. So I apologize for the size of the tables and such, but we've given you an average customer running at about 175 cubic meters consumption per year. So these are your newer users or the average users. And you can see there's the monthly base charge or the quarterly base charge. There's the rate. That translates into a rate for 2020, or sorry, let's go currently. So for currently, it's $8 a month for that base charge, which is about $96 a year. If you consume 175 cubic meters of water through your meter, then you're going to pay an extra $367. So you add those two together. Currently, 2022, a water bill for an average residential user is about $464. If we look at the wastewater side on the bottom, currently it's about $495. So a little bit more. As we step up over time, you can see that there will be an increase of about $90 on the water bill, and for a year, and about $100 on the wastewater. So that's roughly works out to about $185 or $15 a month is the increase on the bill. And we'll sustain those type of increases over the next couple of years. And then once again, everything starts to slow down. Now, if we go to the next slide, it will show you the total combined bill that you'll be paying for both your water and your wastewater. And as you can see, right now, you'd pay for this year or 2022, $959. That'll increase to $1,146, and then $1,368, $1,634, etc. So the monthly bill increase, it's about $15 per month for this year, about $18 per month for next year, rising to about $22. And as you can see, once we get up to that certain level, then the annual increases for 2027 onward start to slow down. If we slow down these increases, the offset is to then issue more debt. So as I was noting, we're trying to increase the transfers to the reserves in order to minimize debt, especially because of the increase in the rates, as well as your debt capacity limits. We don't want to completely exhaust those. Next slide. If we take a look at where you're at currently, you're actually at the lower end of the scale with respect to other member municipalities within the region. You can see you're third to last. That's the blue, and that's your current rate. And these are all rates actually for 2022. All of these are 2022 rates. So if we implement the 2023 rate, you can see it moves you into the middle of the pack with the rest of the municipalities. However, keep in mind that all the rest of the municipalities will be looking at increases on their water and the wastewater rates. So all the rest of those charges will increase as well. To what extent? I would probably say with if people are pre-planning their asset management needs and such, we're probably looking at more sizable increases on a year-to-year basis, not too dissimilar from yourself. One thing I'll point out with Grimsby is that Grimsby has a bit of a unique way of charging. They have a water bill. So they have their volume charge. The wastewater is charged through property taxes. Not many municipalities do that. It's something historically Grimsby's done. So that's why they appear to be at the lower end of the scale. If you actually add it up, they're probably into the middle of the comparative chart. Next slide. And one more, please. So obviously, this presentation just summarizes the capital and operating budget that you'll be reviewing with staff and the corresponding rates. We would say that currently, right now, in consideration for council is basically just the 2023 rates. The 2024 and onward, we've given you those rates in order to give you an indication where we see the trend moving. But I don't think you're looking to approve those rates right now. They'll be coming back to you as part of next year's capital and operating budget process. And I think that concludes my presentation, Madam Chair. I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Gary. So I'm going to open up for any questions from council. Councilor Russell, go ahead.
Oh, you're on mute.
There we go. Much better. Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to Mr. Scanlon. Wondering if the clerk, whoever is running the presentation, can pull up the slide with all of the base charges. It's table 1.1.
Give me 1 second here.
It's page 1-2.
Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Sorry, what slide did you say, Counselor?
It's table 1.1.
I'm part of the presentation.
I think it was pretty early on. Ah, that one right there. Perfect. Okay, so with this in mind, again, we have obviously for a 1/2-inch pipe 2409. My question is with condos, because we have a few that have come online recently, and we also have more coming down the road. What base rate does a condo pay? And I'll give, as an example, maybe some of our staff can give some direct insight. Utopia.
Who are we directing this to? I know you had said Mr. Scanlon, but I'm not sure if that's the appropriate.
I think it might be Mr. Scanlon because
I
was
okay. I don't see any hands up, so
I'm happy, Madam Chair, to start with an answer to the question.
okay,
Obviously, the number of units in that condominium is very important. If it's a 10-story and 10 units per floor, you're probably looking at probably a 2-inch So the $134 for the water, $128 for wastewater would be the appropriate. If it's smaller, like a 5-story, you're probably looking at, you could probably get away with a 1.5.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Scanlon, and Ms. Harris. Yep.
Counselor, I see Jillian Harris has her hand up, so I would like to ask her to speak. Thank you. Go ahead, Jillian.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. The pipe sizes will actually be significantly larger. So Utopia also has a fire line that's metered off of that line, and usage would be significantly higher. So unfortunately, I don't know offhand exactly what that unit is, but when we're looking at kind of our medium or high rises, we're typically looking up in that 6 to 8 inch range. So they would be having the base charges up in that area. So we, again, for condos, for private sites, any of those, we would, their base charges would be based off of the service line that comes in and the meter that is on that service line. So we'd likely be looking at that 6 or 8 inch range. But again, unfortunately, just don't have that on hand right now.
Okay, thank you, Jillian. Counselor, good?
Yeah. No, hold on. Thank you, Madam Chair. So if you keep that that sheet still up. So with that in mind, so again, a Utopia as specific, let's say they're using the 8 inch pipe coming in. So they're paying just the water base rate of $505. Is that for all of the units? Because again, what I'm trying to get at is my entire neighborhood has about 250 homes in it compared to the 240 units in Utopia, and we're paying $25 per household per month on a base charge, where again, if you're dividing 240 into 505, their basic charge per unit is about $1 or $2. And I'm just wondering if that's the way the math works.
That's through you, Chair. No, it would be, so it's a single charge applied to the condo corporation, and everything past that is considered a private system. So the condo corporation would then distribute those rates out. Where we do capture costs primarily on these larger users is really in their usage, and where that volume comes up. So yes, we have the single family homes that also have the usage, but then we're also capturing the increased density in a smaller area with the increased usage that we see through there. And this is as per our policies and procedures that are laid out through past bylaws, and typical to what the majority of municipalities would do as well.
Yeah, so through you then to Mr. Scanlon, are there other municipalities that charge the base rate directly to units? And what I can understand that there is some cost savings based on intensification, but the usage that is still coming out of that building will still be equivalent depending on how many residents there are. And if their usage is even 75 or 80% of what a traditional neighborhood would be with the same amount of houses, why are they getting such a significant deal? And it's not even like a small discount. Like they're getting their base rate is a fraction per unit than what a normal house would be. And I'm wondering how much money we're leaving on the table by having that model, especially looking forward to Prudence when you're going to be looking at much higher buildings, much more number of units, much higher increases in usage. Again, I think we're missing a lot of revenue that we need, to be honest.
So through the chair, my recollection when we worked with the municipality to set this, I think we were looking at the American Water Works Association. There's a principles document that they have, and they as an example, they recommended a rate structure similar to this, and so that the 8 inch really translated into, about 20 times the rate of a single family home. So that is how we structured this, was originally off of the American Water Works Association schedule. Now, if there was a will to change the structure in some way, we could look at that. You don't necessarily have to follow that, but we were looking at trying to establish a basis for the relationships between all of these sized meters.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Scanlon. I see Jillian's got her hand up again, Counselor, so we'll go to Jillian.
Yep, through you, Madam Chair. I also just want to note when Gary is noting the AWWA, that's an umbrella. They do best practices for all of the states and provinces in North America. And again, that typically is followed. So again, if you, and kind of alluding to that, that if you did want to, or have the appetite to explore that, if you did you'd be looking at kind of the zoning perspective and a number of other factors for creating multiple billing rates, and that would definitely be something that have to be larger looked at. But we don't charge every single resident. We charge what goes past property line. Again, we're only responsible for what goes up to property line, and what happens in that private route is where the condo corporation addresses that. So we don't have any means to do the billing further from that.
Thank you, Jillian. Councilor Russell?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not a question, just a comment, and I'm going to quote Councillor Pachariva on this because he has said it many times again about not having an expense problem, us having a revenue problem, and if we are giving or if the condo owners themselves are getting this base rate at a fraction of what a traditional homeowner has to pay. Again, I think that we need to investigate to find out if we're missing a good deal of revenue that, again, we do direly need going forward, especially as we build out into Prudence, and this is going to become a much bigger issue. Thank you.
Councilor Mikulik, I see you've got your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair Timmers. Through you to Gary Scanlon. So earlier you mentioned that you presented a report like July 20th and not much has changed. But in my mind, I feel as though back then interest rates were around 1.5% or so from a financing model. Now we're running, just today we heard it's 4.5%. So with regards to your calculations, your estimations and your projections, how does this play into your forecasting and our rates? Can we expect them to go even further up?
Through the chair, I'm hopeful and based on today's uptick that we have hit the peak on the rates, and we do expect them to come down over time. I think right now it's cooling an aggressive market. We have updated some of the calculations in order to reflect the increase in interest cost. So that's where I'm saying we've made some refinements. They haven't changed significantly. We've, with the added interest cost on the debt, in essence, we've paid for the debt, but we've reduced a little bit what our end balances are on the reserve funds, but we're still able to stay with the regular increases that we had estimated. So we made some adjustments, but we're able to stay in the same order of magnitude of rate increases as we talked about 6 months ago.
Thank you. Councilor, I see Director Wagner has his hand up. So go ahead, Lawrence.
Through you, Chair Timmers, to members of council and to Councilor Mikulik. Great question. In regards to that, it's similar to the reserve study. It's similar to the planning building study. These studies are done at a point in time. So we have the best information we have there. We have a 10-year plan that informs this. There's going to be new projects coming on. There's going to be different things related to macro conditions like inflation costs. There's going to be other drivers that maybe we didn't consider. So I would do the same kind of concept what we're doing with the other things. We test it in a couple of years. Again, we retest it. Just as much as I say, if in a couple of years, if the BOC or the Bank of Canada decides to lower interest rates because inflation's in hand, obviously our borrowing costs go down, which means that our cost escalation or forecasted cost of debt goes down. It's fluid. So every couple of years, we'll continue to test the model. We'll look at it, and I think that's appropriate. I just want to remind council that rates and fees are approved on an annual basis. So we will be looking on this on a regular basis. We will be looking at the 10-year plan. We talked about remapping the 10-year plan and pushing things out. All of these things interconnect. All of these things can create change in this plan. I do not suspect rates will go down in that regards. I suspect, if anything, if borrowing rates and project is pushed out, the rate increases year over year may decline or not be as aggressive. But as you've seen from the other night from the capital presentation, we are envisioning taking on a lot of debt. And in order to do this, we have to incur increased costs or user fees to pay for some of this.
Thank you, Councillor Mikulik. Did you have another question?
Another question through you to Gary Scanlon. Just you know, with regards to like, I'm having trouble with existing residents, you know, having to pay quite a substantial amount of money in the future in the next 4 years in terms of increased water rates to pay for growth. Is there any other way to have this growth paid for other than by the residents that are living here that may not necessarily be appreciating or wanting to see this growth?
Through the chair, unfortunately, if we're speaking, Councillor, to Bill 23, that's unfortunate that there is a shift of the cost onto the existing ratepayer. That's a decision the province has made. Are there other alternatives? There may be some refinements in certain things like local service policies, where we may have some more of the localized cost burdens absorbed by the developing landowners, but there's not a lot of opportunity for us. We're kind of locked into the legislation. As I say, there's some things we might be able to do with it, but we haven't got, we can't negate these recent changes that the province has put out on us.
Thank you for that answer. Through you, Chair. I do appreciate water. I do appreciate taking a shower in the morning, but I don't want it to get so expensive that I wish I had a well. That's what I'm worried about. And I think, you know, there's a lot of us, and with this sort of thing, we don't have a lot of control, you know, over that. So I just want to make sure that, you know, as a taxpayer, as a ratepayer, that, you know, that this is all being well thought out and not, which of course it is. That's why you're here. But at the same time, it's quite substantial increase. I'm having trouble with that. Thank you.
Councillor, I see Jillian has her hand up. Go ahead, Jillian.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, I do also want to note that while there are portions of the program and that we're funding that are associated with growth, there's also a significant portion that's tied to assets that are at the end of their life and do need to be replaced. We have a pretty large or a decent program with that, and we do have funding to support that, or some grants to support that, but it does make up part of what we're looking at from that and the overall increase. And we are being mindful of what the increase is. And I would like to refer back to the chart that showed, if you can look at your documents, the chart that showed kind of where we were, which was at the very bottom of the LAMs. With the rates, and this increase that we're proposing is going to bring us into the middle. And I do want to note that, and I think Gary made the note as well, that a number of other municipalities are either going through it or will be going through it shortly. So I anticipate that as we're moving to the middle, we're probably going to see us moving back down towards the lower end and the more affordable end of rates within the LAMs across Niagara.
Thank you, Jillian. Thank you, Councillor.
Just a follow up to Jillian, and I know I could have swore I saw it somewhere in this report. It's quite a bit, but do you know off the top of your head what increase is attributed to growth? What percentage of, you know, as opposed to existing infrastructure? We have an obligation to maintain existing infrastructure, but then there's a percentage of this debt that we're taking on that is attributed to growth, new growth, as opposed to.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Who are we directing this to? To Jillian?
Either Jillian or
yes?
Mr. Wagner.
Got her hand. Okay, go ahead, Jillian.
through you, Madam Chair, and Lawrence can hop on after. So the portion that is attributed to debt that we have to cover related to growth is due to, again, the asset that we're replacing or upsizing to support growth has some value or benefit to our existing ratepayers. Either the pipe is getting older and there's a portion that we have to attribute to it from that perspective. Unfortunately, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but you do have to keep that in mind as well. If the percentage that we have to pay that aren't fully DC funded is because there is a benefit to existing users and to our existing assets.
Okay, thank you, Jillian. And I see Gary Scanlon. Did you have some comments as well?
No, I was trying to find an answer quickly to the councilor's question, but I would note that the debt is more sizable on the replacement of the assets than it is on the development charge. A lot of the debt for development charge will be picked up. Well, a lot of the growth related will be picked up by development charges. We're expecting you're going to lose in the first 5 years somewhere in the range of about 10%. On average, 10% of your DC revenues will be lost. After that, it'll be somewhat less, but we haven't gone through to calculate all the losses due to exemptions and et cetera. So it's probably in the early stages, maybe a certain percent. And the debt charges, like for water, are in and around 650,000 by the time we hit the end. So, anyway, I can get back to you, Councillor, to answer that question. It's just too complex in 30 seconds to calculate that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Councillor Russell, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just coming back to my line of questioning earlier, I just want to put a motion on the floor. Again, independent of the approval on the water and wastewater vote for tonight, that we ask staff to come back with a report on right sizing our base water rates to intensification based builds or developments, i.e. condominiums. So that we are making sure that we are leveraging as much as we can to offset some of those long-term costs that our traditional residents are facing.
Thank you, Councillor. So you're looking for staff to come back with some kind of a report on that. That's what you're asking for. Okay.
And it's independent of the vote.
Right. Yes. Outside of it, you're looking for more information, basically. Okay. I see our CAO has his hand up. Go ahead, Mike.
Through you, Madam Chair, if I could just make a small suggestion. Staff have been chatting. Why don't we come back and maybe share with council what are some of the best practices in the industry in doing it? I know the council inferred right sizing. Right sizing is an inference on an outcome that we haven't determined yet. So my thought would be a little bit more of a neutral direction to staff, but I'm in council's hands if you still want to go with the term right sizing.
Councillor Russell, how do you want to proceed with that? I agree the information is not really available at this point to right size it. I think the CAO's suggestion is a good one.
I would agree, Madam Chair, but again, I think just based on need, there is a need to have some sort of adjective in there to describe what we're trying to achieve here. And it's not just bring back a report on best practices, because right now there may not be any municipality out there in the province that is doing this. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it is right or wrong. But if we have a need and we have a means to get to that outcome that we're trying to address, I think we need to examine it. So.
Okay, well, I see our CAO wants to respond. Go ahead, Mike.
Through your chair, Timmer. So if I could say that staff bring back the best practices and the feasibility of looking at alternate options that would see a potential increase in base charges for higher density development. Like I get where the councilor is going. So I would suggest maybe something like that. Let us go back and look and examine the feasibility of what the councilor is doing. And then we can figure out, is it cheaper to deliver water to condos? Is that why people do it? and look at what is both the legal feasibility, where we have rights and where we don't have rights, and maybe come back with all of that.
So I'll send a quick motion over to Devan with that wording, and then she can do it.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I see Councilor Regina. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Just clarification. I guess I kind of rightly or wrongly assumed that 500 and whatever dollar base charge for the 8-inch pipe was based on our calculation of the cost to deliver water to a condominium. And that's sort of the underlying assumption on all these base rate charges that we have. So I'm hearing that we don't know that for sure, and that we have to have another look at it.
Through you, Madam Chair, I see Jillian's hand up. I
Yes.
mean, you're correct, Councillor, in that assumption in terms of where we have responsibility and where we don't. I think the direction or the motion on the table from council potentially that you'll all vote on is there another methodology or approach that we could examine? I know we are looking at some additional work on this particular topic, so glad to see that it isn't part of what we're doing at right now. We are looking at a financial plan review that we can incorporate this into as well. So I think there's an opportunity, but Jillian may have something additional that I forgot or didn't include.
Through you, Madam Chair. No, I was going to agree that the base charge that we have identified is based off of the costs that we to address the costs of getting that 8-inch pipe and providing that service to property line. And I would reiterate what CAO.
So I guess the only other option is to look at a way of just sort of spreading it evenly across the municipality, and your base costs are spread evenly amongst every, like a per capita basis or something. I'm asking questions, but I guess we'll wait and see what the response is when we get it back. Thank you.
Let's put the motion up, and if there's any comments around that motion, and let's see what staff come back with.
Thank you, Chair. I am just waiting for the motion to be sent by Councillor Russell for his wording.
If I can, some of that wording might be amended based on what the CAO had suggested, but we can take comments, Chair Timmers, once that motion is developed. So if there's other comments besides that motion, you might want to just go to that for now.
So while we're waiting, any other comments? No, seeing no one. So we'll wait for that motion.
I did send it over, man. I don't know if you want me to read it first and then have comments on it, Madam Chair.
I just got it. I'm just going to copy it into a Word document here.
I think it's good if it's on the screen, Councillor Russell.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, while she's copying it, that staff come back with a report to investigate the best practices of other municipalities and the feasibility to address the base rate charges of higher density developments. I missed a P in development. My apologies.
I see our CAO nodding. Did you have a comment? You're good with that motion? Okay.
Dense. All right. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
If you can just enlarge that a little bit, Devan.
Oh my goodness. There we go.
Okay. Any comments to this motion? Or I can't see everyone on the call. Let me just scroll here. I see Councilor Regina, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to suggest a word change that staff come back with a report to investigate the best practices of other municipalities and feasibility of increasing the base rate charges for higher density developments.
of increasing. Counselor Russell, are you?
Yes, he put his hands up.
Okay.
He's good.
Okay.
Increasing.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Counselor. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands up at this moment. Madam Clerk, do we need a seconder on this motion?
No, Chair, we do not, but the town clerk would like to say something.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was
Okay.
about to answer. Sorry, Devan.
That's okay.
You're right. We don't take seconders at committee of the
Right.
whole, but we.
Oh, right, of course. Of course. Okay, thank you, Madam Clerk. Okay, so we have the motion and I don't see anybody with their hands up. So Madam Clerk or Deputy Clerk, can you call the vote on the motion?
Absolutely, Chair. Thank you. And through you, that motion is as was on the screen. So all those in favor, I'll get you to raise your hand, please. Thank you. And all those opposed? Thank you. That carries.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, I'm not seeing any other hands at this moment. So I would like to thank Sean Michael and Gary Scanlon and Byron Tan for your presentations tonight and taking all of our questions. Great discussion. Thank you very much.
Our pleasure.
Have a good rest of your evening.
Bye-bye.
So I am now moving to a motion moved by Councillor Reimer. Receive and file report FN-01-23 regarding 2023 fees and charges, and receive and file for information the rates and fees study, planning, building, clerks and licensing fees, and associated presentation in Appendix A. And receive and file for information the water and wastewater rate study and associated presentation in Appendix B, and approve the 2023 fees and charges as outlined in Appendix C, and approve the fees and charges bylaw as outlined in Appendix D, effective February 1st, 2023, unless otherwise indicated, and repeal bylaw 2021-95. Deputy Clerk, if you could call the vote. I see Councillor Mikulik. Go ahead, Councillor.
Thank you very much, Chair Timmers. Just, I wasn't sure if we were going to discuss any of the other fees this evening or not, but I just I've been talking with the Director Wagner, and I was hoping, like, is there any way that we can increase that 1.25% late fees and penalties? That runs at about 15% interest, and that might have been good, or that might have been fine a year ago, 2 years ago, but now times have changed where I don't want people, I don't know if it's a good idea for us as a municipality to be having, to be a bank for those that are not paying their bills on time.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. We have read the motion. But I do see Director Wagner has his hand up, so I will go to him for comment.
Through your Chair Timmers, members of council, Councilor Mikulik. Yes, I did look at that. For the Municipal Act, the province has restricted the amount a municipality can charge on a monthly basis to apply for arrears or late payments and the such. I do tend to agree as with you, Councillor, that if it's not the appropriate size of stick, people will make potentially a trade-off of paying the town and its obligations to its town for property tax versus, say, a credit card that's running 30%. It's just common sense. But in this case, the municipality is restricted by legislation to maintain that level. It would be something that the province would have to enact or make changes to the Municipal Act itself, or make those kind of changes. The last time they had such kind of flexibility was in 2003, prior to 2003, when they repealed the flexibility for municipalities through bylaw to make those kind of adjustments. It might be something the province should look at, or potentially municipalities raise at for future discussions with the province.
So, Director Wagner. Okay, Councillor?
Just a follow-up to our director. How would we best approach this if we were to wanting to advocate for an increase? What would our best approach be?
Through you, Chair Timmers, local MPs, local members of parliament, provincial parliament, so local MPPs, Sam Ustroff, Roma, Amo, and just mention that it's a concern or something to consider. Obviously, they would have to table it for royal assent or approval through legislation, and they would have to assess whether it's of merit, but has to be raised as a concern because they control that process. It's not a municipality. So it can be brought up in those kind of discussions. I'm not sure if they would change, but that would be how I would approach it. And and because it's a municipal act, it's under the Municipal Affairs and Housing. I believe it's Minister Clark would be the appropriate venue as well.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Director Whitmer. Okay, Councillor Mikulik, we're now going to vote on the motion that's on the table. Does anyone want me to repeat the motion? No, we're good. Okay, Deputy Clerk, if you could please call the vote.
Thank you, Chair. And all those in favor? Thank you. All those opposed? Thank you. And that carries.
Thank you very much. We have no confidential items this evening. Do we have any committee remarks? Seeing none. There being no further business, I call this meeting adjourned at 8:15 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your evening.
Thanks, Madam Chair.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night, all.